All right, we will go ahead and get started. It's a couple of minutes after. I know participants are still joining from multiple countries and regions. Thank you everyone for joining the 7th webinar in the Horticulture for Development Professional Series on how to use monitoring and evaluation tools to guide project success. Welcome to those who are here for the first time and those who have been with us over the past 6 webinars. We're glad to have you. For those who are unfamiliar with the series, as usual, this series is focused on providing professional development for researchers, students, practitioners, and others interested in the intersections between horticulture and international development. As usual, webinars are scheduled every Thursday through September 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So we are in the 7th webinar, and we have 2 more after this week. Taking a moment just to introduce our organizing entity for these webinars. The Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Horticulture, or the Horticulture Innovation Lab, is a global research network that advances fruit and vegetable innovations, empowering smallholder farmers to earn more income while better nourishing our communities. We are based at the University of California, Davis, and have been funded by USAID for 10 years to conduct horticulture research. We currently have about 22 projects in 14 different countries throughout the world. We decided it was important to do this series because horticulture is a critical aspect of addressing malnutrition and obesity while also creating wealth, particularly for women, youth, and other marginalized populations. Over this series and these 9 webinars, including this one, we're really hoping to pass along lessons that we've learned from our experience over the past 10 years to help build capacity in project management and promote the importance of fruits and vegetables globally. As many of you know, my name is Kyle Friedman, and I'm the host for this series. I am currently a graduate researcher for the Horticulture Innovation Lab at UC Davis. I previously worked at RTI International, managing large donor-funded food security and agriculture projects, and I'm really excited to continue this series with you. As usual, a few housekeeping items before I introduce our presenter. Participants are muted during the presentation. Any questions that you have along the way, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A function of your Zoom control. If you want to use the chat, you can, but the Q&A function will allow everyone to see questions, and it'll be easier for us to address those at the end. Also, a reminder that we always have a brief survey at the end of the session. We really value feedback that you give for these particular topics, as well as the general flow and setup of our webinars to inform future events. So please be sure to complete that survey at the end of this webinar. Really excited to introduce our presenter today, who is Molly Chen of RTI International, a dear former colleague of mine. So I'm really excited to be able to go through this presentation with Molly. Molly specializes in monitoring, evaluation, research, learning, and adapting for a portfolio of technical global health projects related to HIV, AIDS, malaria, neglected tropical diseases, and health system strengthening. Having worked in project management for many years, monitoring and evaluation is always something that oftentimes is a mystery to me. So I'm really excited for Molly to make monitoring and evaluation a bit more clear to myself and to the rest of our audience. So Molly, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead with your presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kyle. And yeah, was very excited when you reached out to invite me to do this webinar. So glad to be here, and good morning or good evening, wherever you are joining from, and glad to have you part of this webinar. So let me start here. Okay. So today I'll be talking about monitoring, evaluation, and learning. As you see from my particular title and coming from RTI International, we are definitely founded in research, and so I won't focus as much as that. When Kyle asked me to present on this webinar, I did keep this fairly high level and want to run through the basics of monitoring, evaluation, learning, and I will draw from my experience, mainly from USAID funded programs. But if there are any questions that are not related to USAID, that's no problem. I love to talk about monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So let's dive right in. So what is monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which I'm just going to refer to from this time on as just MEL, otherwise I'll take up my entire webinar. So MEL is a systematic approach to measure performance and results, aid decision-making, learn from successes and challenges, and adapt either the project or program to help reach the intended objectives. So I'm going to talk about how MEL is important for these three different areas: project management, accountability, and program effectiveness. So MEL, and as Kyle mentioned, I mean, it's great for good project management. You know, I actually have a background in project management for many years, and when I started to delve into MEL, really realized that it is a very useful tool, approach, way of living, way of doing great project management. And the reason why is because it allows us to make sure that our performance is being executed relative to what we've planned, that the fidelity of our implementation across different sites, different groups is sound, that the effectiveness of our actions in reaching our anticipated results and objectives is also part of our action plan, and that any adjustments that are needed can help us increase effectiveness. For accountability, as I mentioned, I will kind of speak more from my experience with USAID. The MEL helps us really effectively communicate with our partners, with our donors, with our beneficiaries. It helps us account for the resources, such as money and time, and allows us to really know what our resources are doing for us in our program. And lastly, it's important to increase program effectiveness. So helps us test our assumptions that we make at the beginning of a program, and are constantly iterating through the program, make evidence-based decisions, adjusting our program activities based on what's working and what's not working, because sometimes things are not working, and apply learning to other related programs as well. I think this is important to address. So who is MEL important to and why? So to donors, as I've mentioned, it really helps a program measure its achievements and provide accountability for funding. For beneficiaries, it helps a program track their activities, outputs, results to provide transparency, and allows them to help with their reporting as well. To our staff, including our MEL staff, our technical staff, and financial and operations staff, it helps us to guide the implementation of our activities in a standardized and coordinated way. And to our leadership, and this is, I think, extremely important, it really helps to provide that evidence for decision making. So thanks for allowing me that introduction. I think that's a good way to sort of dive into more of the tools portion of this webinar, where I will talk about these tools that I have listed here. So let's jump right into starting off with theory of change. So a theory of change is an if and then statement that describes what we are intending to do in reference to a stated problem. And I am going to provide some examples, so hopefully not just talking the theory of this. It also allows us to clearly state what the intended outcome of a program is, and shows us as the implementer of a program or project on how and why we actually believe that this change is going to occur based on the activities that we have presented. Sometimes a theory of change is called a development hypothesis as well. And oftentimes I think theory of change can get a little bit confused with some of the other frameworks that allow you to really ground your program. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how a theory of change in relation to a results framework, and a little bit about a logical framework and how they work together. So this is, as I mentioned, it's the basic theory, the basic structure of a theory of change statement of a graphical depiction. There's different ways that you can demonstrate your theory of change. But oftentimes we do see it as a narrative. It's an if and then statement. And this is sort of the structure of a theory of change. So starting off with if we do these activities, so really thinking through what activities, what interventions are we proposing as an implementer, as a project to be able to help our donor, our funder be able to reach the outcome objectives that they have laid out. The middle part is really the short-term outcomes. So oftentimes, and as I mentioned, I'll have some examples in the next slide, but really like what happens in the short term before we are able to reach the long-term outcome. So it's if we do these activities, then we can get this result in the short term, and then it's really the project goal, the big impact, and it's usually a long-term goal. Sometimes it's not realized within even the period of performance or the time that has been allocated for a program. So drawing back to USAID programs, oftentimes we're looking at a 5-year cycle, sometimes a 10-year cycle, but within that 5-year cycle, that long-term goal, we can maybe not see it completely realized, but we want to be able to understand where and how our activities have contributed to reaching that goal. So moving forward here, so just I just wanted to have some really simple examples of a project theory of change. So the first, using education, an education project as one. So if we train teachers on curriculum delivery, so remember again, this is where we are talking about the activities and the interventions that we are proposing. And then the short-term outcomes. So in this example, it's then students will receive quality instruction on reading, okay? So within the program, so probably within the 5 years and within the time period that is allocated, we will measure, we will work on really seeing if students are able to receive quality instruction on reading. I'm sure some of you M&A specialists are out there are thinking, how are we measuring quality? Okay, and fair point, but I'm not gonna get into that right here. We do have a section on indicators coming up. But then reaching the longer term outcome, the impact goal, which is students ages 7 to 10 will have improved literacy, right? And so we will also have indicators and ways that we would measure that. And the other example is an agriculture project theory of change. Moving forward. So the other way that we really do lay out our MEL plan, our plan for performance management to our donor, to USAID specifically. So this is based more on a USAID results framework, but we are starting off with the high level impacts. So as I wrote here, USAID might call it a development objective. Sometimes I've seen it called a strategic objective. Oftentimes it's pulled from a USAID country development cooperation strategy that I can also include in the references for those of you that aren't familiar with that specific term. Moving down to the next level, which is the primary goal or objective of the program or project. And then the next level there is the intermediate results area. So these are really the major results necessary to achieve the primary goal. And I will have an example in the next slide that we can talk through a little bit more. And then under these intermediate results, there's always different things that are happening in order for a major result to happen. So these are the sub-results that we outline as the things that are happening in the interim that will allow us to reach these larger results areas. So a results framework, it allows us to really identify the ultimate goal of the interventions. As you can see, it's laid out a little bit in more of a hierarchical structure. And it's a great conceptual tool used for planning and program management and also proposals. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So results frameworks oftentimes as a MERLA specialist is where I start. So whether USAID or any donor has given us as an implementer a results framework to start with, really starting off by ground truthing your results framework and or your theory of change is really, I think, the best way to get into the mindset of what exactly are we trying to achieve here? and how do we plan? And I would say that how is what oftentimes people get caught into when they start, doing the work plan and they won the they won the project and they really start just diving into the activities. But before even really thinking of the activities, let's think about what types of intermediate results are we trying to achieve in order to help us achieve the program objective that's been outlined by USAID and the strategic objective that maybe is also outlined by a mission or kind of the greater entity that is part of this work. So going into the example, and I've stayed on using this education one. I think it's a little bit easier to kind of see how some of these causal linkages are. But so this project results framework, as you guys can see, so this overall project objective is improved literacy outcomes. As I've mentioned, and this also is, as you can probably see how it aligns with the theory of change, is this is the longer term outcome that we expect to see some movement towards the project objective, that we expect to see either targets met that we've set out, but maybe it won't be until the end of the program. So if we're looking at a 5-year cycle, we would want to know the benchmarks and different milestones that we'd want to hit along the way until we are able to really see what has been the impact of all of our programs and interventions at the end of 5 years. So as we're moving down, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, following the results framework example, is then the intermediate results are improved classroom instruction, improved learning methods, and resources for students. So one thing to keep in mind about the intermediate results stage of this is that these are different results that are happening simultaneously, or that are they're different programming is happening all at the same time, and these are things that we're working together to be able to reach the longer term outcome. And then that last level is really the sub-IR level. Some of it's activity based, sometimes it's just smaller subsets of each result area. So moving on to indicators. So I have a very formal definition here, but let me just read this quickly. An indicator is a variable that measures one aspect of a program or project that is directly related to the program's objectives. An indicator is a variable whose value changes from the baseline level at the time the program began to a new value after the program. And it, oh, excuse me, just kind of jumped. At the time the program began to a new value after the program, and its activities have made their impact felt. At that point, the variable or indicator is calculated again. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into some examples. And then secondly, an indicator is a measurement. So I think that's how most of us know an indicator as, right? It really measures the value of change in meaningful units that can be compared to past and future units. Usually expressed as a percentage or a number, but can also be expressed in other ways and other measurements. But I'll just kind of put that there, since that's how I think most of us are used to seeing indicators. So different level of indicators. So starting off with input indicators. So these indicators track the number and nature of material, financial, human resources that are made available through the project to support achieving the outcomes. So they're typically expressed in quantitative terms. So maybe like the amount of a given input provided, such as number of hours spent to prepare for a training. So it's really the input of the program spent on an activity. Moving on to output indicators. So these indicators represent the direct result of project-supported inputs. So we just had input indicators, and they are often expressed in quantitative terms, often also with a qualitative element. So example is number or proportion of teachers trained to a given level of competency. And moving forward to the next level is outcome indicators. So, really capturing those changes that we just talked about that are expected to be a result of our inputs, processes, outputs. And these are the ones which, when we were looking at the theory of change as well as the results framework, these can occur in the short term or the long term. an example could be sort of following the examples we've been using is, again, maybe improved curriculum delivery. And then lastly, the impact indicator. So this really, this reflects systemic changes in beneficiaries' health, education, livelihood. Again, thinking back at our results frameworks and theory of change, this really is like that highest level, that last part, that last leg of this journey is, what do we want to see in 5 years, 10 years, over a long period. And I'll just take a quick moment to talk about some other indicators that aren't listed here, but we do have process indicators that really allow us to track sort of processes, activities, tasks. These are really helpful, especially from a project management standpoint, right? It helps us track maybe time spent or time spent and how we are actually being able to reach these key milestones. So process is more of like a project management, I would say, tool. Another one is context indicators. So these context indicators are really allowing us to monitor factors outside the control of the project, but have a potential to affect the achievement of results. So these, often allow us to kind of take the temperature of the environment that we're working in, to make sure that we're tracking these factors, but that we realize that they're a little bit they're outside of the control of the program. So in designing indicators, we use a S.M.A.R.T methodology. As you can see, it's listed here, but let me talk a little bit about these as well. So indicators should be specific, measurable, attainable. Sometimes also I've seen the A be referred to as accessible, affordable. Okay, so kind of, if anything, I think they have kind of the general feel of that. R is relevant, and then T is time bound, so done in a timely manner. So let me talk about each of these very briefly. So we're talking about an indicator being specific. We say, while the outcome result itself can be broad, we should have an indicator that is narrow and should focus on the who and what of the intervention. Additionally, how and where, and a lot of times for USAID programs, we find a lot of this information in what we call the performance indicator reference sheets. So these are reference sheets that we create for each indicator, and it really allows us to show our project team how we plan on measuring this indicator and who will be doing that and what time, so specific. For measurable, so that this indicator has the capacity to be counted, observed, analyzed, tested, or challenged. So, if we can't measure this indicator, then we really can't determine whether we've made progress. Attainable, so again, achievable both as a result of the program and as a measure of realism. That our target is set appropriately, that is based on a baseline that we've been able to really ground truth with our data. I'll talk a little bit about baselines and targets shortly. So relevant, so it should be a valid measure of the result or outcome, and linked to related research and professional expertise. So this is really where I think we can bring in our technical staff to help us ground truth these indicators. And then the last one is time bound. The indicator really should be measured in some type of time frame. When will it be measured? Because how else will we really know when we plan on reaching a result or outcome and or target? So that is S.M.A.R.T indicators. So I'll talk a little bit about baselines, but maybe more about why establish baselines. So, it allows us to really know where we started, right? And again, if you remember, the definition of an indicator is that it allows us to measure a change. And so baselines help us determine if progress is being achieved, to what extent has a change happened. And I just write here, the lack of a baseline data, presents challenges. I think probably we can understand where, if you don't know where you started, you don't really know where you're ending up. But Oftentimes, baselines are collected through a mixed method of primary, secondary data collection. I would say for most programs, it's best to plan a primary data collection for baselines as soon as you can. It often does take a lot longer and a lot more resources than sometimes we plan for. So I would say that one of the first things that I do with my teams is we talk about baselines as soon as we are able to get a draft indicator list. Is what is the realistic time frame that we'll be able to collect this data? Secondary data collection is also very common for baselines. So, drawing from previous project sources, other available data sets, whether that's census data or other types of, nationally available data that's been collected as well. Those are also good baseline sources for indicators. And then on the other side is targets. So why establish targets? I mean, again, it allows us within the time period that we're given. So USAID, maybe if we're talking about a 5-year period, sometimes we establish annual targets to really keep us on track of, within the first year, second, third, fourth year, what are some interim targets that we would like to make sure that we are hitting. I like this, this description that says, targets serve as guideposts for monitoring. It really allows us to know whether we're on schedule. And the last point is talking about transparency and accountability. So you guys remember at the very beginning of this webinar, I was talking about how MEL really is important for accountability. So targets allow us to set expectations and I would say common goals between you as a project implementer, your donor, beneficiaries, other stakeholders to say, upon starting this project, what are things that we plan on reaching? So it's to say that's very important to be on the same page as these other partners as you are moving forward through your program to establish targets together. So I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit more about evaluation. So we can go very deep into evaluation, but I just wanted to kind of give a brief overview of probably the more common types of evaluation that we often see. So internal evaluation, performance evaluation, assessment, and impact evaluation. And I write here, decision on which type of evaluation is the which we will proceed with really depends on the stage of project planning and budget. So I'll talk a little bit more about these four in the next slide. So an internal evaluation is process of quality review undertaken within an institution for its own ends, and or within an own project. So in my own experience, internal evaluations, I think, are just absolute valuable tools to have for a project, for the leadership of a project as well. So a lot of the tools that we've talked about already, right? The results framework, the theory of change, the indicators, setting targets, setting baselines. I mean, these are all meant to be served as tools to make sure that you are on the right track, right? For all intents and purposes, it's really to make sure that we are all on the same page. And an internal evaluation can be undertaken, maybe at the midpoint of a program to allow a program to really see if they are reaching those goals, they are reaching those benchmarks. It also, I think, is a really good exercise for the program to undergo something like an internal evaluation to perhaps prepare themselves for an external evaluation, which, at least in USAID, oftentimes are performance evaluations. So these often come at the end of a program. So the reason I mentioned that an internal evaluation is a great way to prepare for an external evaluation is because, one, it allows the program to really take a hard look at their program to see if they are achieving their targets, et cetera. But it allows them to prepare also for performance evaluation. And performance evaluations can have a broad mix of methods. I do write that it often is an external, it's often commissioned and is managed outside of the implementing organization. So USAID missions and projects oftentimes will hire an external evaluator, whether that's an individual or another firm or company, to come and to conduct a performance evaluation. Assessments. So this can, I mean, there's so many different types of assessments, but it's really that we're investigating, a certain aspect of a sector or a geographic area. So I would say more often than not, we're doing stakeholder assessments, analyses. We're doing a needs assessment, just depending on really, I think, where you are in the program. So oftentimes these can happen throughout the program, but it's a great way of either starting off starting off a program, maybe conducting a needs assessment for your targeted group to figure out what the best type of programming will be, and moving through the program and taking a look at what your initial needs assessment was. And lastly, I'll just mention impact evaluations, right? So really looking at an attributable change. These are based on cause-effect models and do require counterfactual. So the one thing I will say is that impact evaluations coming from RTI International, we often do find that they do take a little bit longer. Some of you are probably laughing at my saying a little bit longer, but in terms of planning it out, I would say that impact evaluations, you can absolutely find just very compelling findings from that, but planning that within your program is very important. So, evaluation just in general, it really allows you to collect, analyze, use information to answer questions about the project and policies, programs, how effective have they been? Have they reached their targets? Allows you to plan for maybe the next iteration of the program, but it's a wonderful tool to be able to utilize for good program management. So I'll move on next to talking a little bit about learning. So learning as part of the MEL cycle. So learning really is part of the cycle. It doesn't take place as, it's not as cyclical, I think, as sometimes we see M&E, right? We're collecting M&E data, then we're conducting an evaluation, et cetera. Learning, I think, can happen all the way throughout a program. It can happen informally, formally. I mean, large, small scales, internally, externally. I'll talk a little bit about RTI's experience and my own experience doing learning. Learning really, I would say, having worked in M&E for a number of years now, learning, I will say, is like our secret weapon. It really allows us to take a hard look at, not just the M&E data coming in, but allows us to ask questions about perhaps information gaps that we're seeing and or interventions that we are witnessing maybe when we're out there doing a site visit that, hey, I would really love to know more about this particular intervention. Learning allows us to take time and, I don't want to always say resources because it oftentimes I think can be confused with being another part of M&E or another thing that we have to do. The reason why I say it's our secret weapon is because you can often just, tack on learning as part of your regular check-ins. I have a couple of examples here: pause and reflect sessions, after action reviews, portfolio reviews. As you guys can probably see, I mean, a lot of times these are events and activities that are already happening with our donors, with our beneficiaries, but having a learning lens when you approach these meetings allows us to really be able to ask other questions. And there are a few more formal ways that we can do learning, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So why is learning important? And I guess I've talked a little bit about these as well, but I think what we found in the last few years, and I really applaud USAID for leading the charge and saying, okay, we've done a great job collecting M&E data, but oftentimes we're collecting so much data that, and checking off the boxes of whether we've reached our targets and all those things we just talked about, which are extremely and critically important. But if we don't stop to really take a look at the why and, and maybe what else, learning allows us to do that. And if anything, I really appreciate sometimes having this lens because it makes me stop and think. I always try not to use pause and reflect in my own description of saying stop and think, but it really does allow me as a MERLA specialist to ask, our chief of party or our programs, what else? And is this the best, is this the best intervention, or is this the best way that we are going about it? And, it's not to say that it's not a finger pointing exercise. I think and I found that your staff will appreciate having that space to explore options and to discuss a little bit further of the things that they're saying. So it's really a great collaboration tool. And I will end with talking a little bit about the USAID collaborating, learning, and adapting. So there's CLA framework and tools. So this comes out of the USAID Learning Lab, which has been a really great repository and resource. And I have shared it in my resource list. But if any of you are ever curious about how to kind of get started with learning, they have some really great, just basic tools to get your program started. This framework is something that we use within our programs. And oftentimes we don't tackle every single one. So there's different pieces here that are part of the framework. But sometimes if we need to talk a little bit about, the culture that we are working in, do we have a culture of openness? Do we have I don't know if you guys can see that, it's a little bit smaller, but, do we have the relationships and networks? I mean, sometimes some of the softer skills and some of the more nuanced areas of a program can really be brought out when you use the CLA framework. And they have different tools to really guide that. So I just wanted to do a quick plug for that. And with that, I believe that's my last slide. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Molly. And thanks everyone for joining. We'll jump into Q&A. Monitoring and evaluation is a very complex topic and has a lot of nuances and details. And so I feel like this has been helpful to really scratch the surface in understanding the key concepts. And I know a lot of our participants probably have more specific questions. So I think just to open us up, I think monitoring and evaluation is evolved over time. And so I think we've seen it as monitoring and evaluation, as MEL with the learning component. There's MERLA, there's MERL. And so I think, people working in international development see a lot of different organizations using different terms. And so I'm hoping maybe, Molly, you can sort of give your perspective on, what's driving that. Is that just organizations trying to use their own terms for, their own kind of branding or perspective of monitoring and evaluation? Do donors drive that? How does that work in terms of that terminology?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kyle. From my own experience, I would say I started off as an M&E specialist with learning experience, and now I'm a MERLA specialist. Cat's out of the bag to where I think at least as practitioners, we have tried to be very intentional about bringing, especially those that are not familiar with the term M&E even, right, is to really just say that we are looking at a body of work, a suite of tools that can really help with project management. And so I guess that's to say that there isn't really a huge difference. I mean, they all mean more or less the same thing. Some of it is donor driven, right? And organizationally driven. Here at RTI, we ourselves are not all MERLA specialists, right? Some are MEL specialists, and it really is, I will say, there isn't a huge difference, and to not get caught up in the confusion about that. I've also seen, MERCLAC, right, with including that collaboration piece there. But at the end of the day, these acronyms and these terms are really just trying to convey, I think, that it is a holistic approach to performance management, right? To really supporting a program with monitoring, evaluation, research, learning, and maybe some CLA tools depending on where you sit in a project.
Great, that's very helpful. Another more specific question. So would you say that outcome and impact indicators are typically expressed as qualitative or quantitative values? And also, if I know this could get into maybe it's own session, but if you could speak a little bit more about what a counterfactual is for the group.
Sure. Yeah, that's no problem. So I guess two separate questions.
Yes.
I mean, impact and outcome indicators, I will say it really just depends on the program and the project. So, I mean, my work has been primarily in global health. So yes, a lot of our, we are looking at health outcomes, so improved, you know, maternal mortality rates over time. So that's definitely expressed a little bit more quantitatively. However, I will say that I recently supported an energy project that, their impact indicator was really looking at megawatts megawatts generated, right? And that was a new term for me. And I would say it really depends on, I think, the specific area of work that that you're looking at. So it's probably hard for me to say that it's usually, I mean, we do express it. Sometimes it just depends on how easy it is to measure that. And then a counterfactual. So this is really where we have a control group. So I am not an impact evaluation expert, so hopefully I'm not butchering this for any of those out there. But it's really to make sure that, within a designated period of time and, with a control group that we are measuring the impact of our interventions on a group that is experiencing some type of intervention versus one that isn't. So that is why I think, and I had mentioned earlier, these really do take a lot more planning and time than sometimes like, performance evaluation, assessment, some of the other types of evaluations I mentioned.
Great, thank you. Another question is just differentiating between the terms that get used of theory of change and logic model in terms of, are there differences between those? And then advice for measuring long-term changes and impacts that might be hard to do within a shorter term project cycle.
Yeah.
2 more questions for you.
Yeah. You're sneaking in 2 or 3 within one, Cal. I like it. Okay, so the first, and I do apologize. I realized I cut out our logic model slide due to, I thought it was going to go a little bit long, so I'll provide that resource after as well. That's a great question. So, and this is, I think, where it often gets confused. I will say I often walk into project teams or proposal teams, and we can spend hours talking about, what's a theory of change versus a results framework versus a logical framework. I mean, I will say they're all tools that allow you to really ground your program, right? So some of the ones, so we really started off like very high level. Your theory of change is looking at, your if and then statement, figuring out what are you proposing to reach the intended change. I mean, to simplify it, right? A logical framework really helps you extend more into a planning stage. So a logical framework, if you guys remember from the results framework, it's separated by different levels of results. So you have your sub-intermediate results, reaching your result areas. So logical framework kind of allows you to plan a little bit more into terms of those inputs that we discussed. So, what are the resources that are going to be available to you in your program? It also has an area for activities, also for indicators. So a logical framework, I would say, is a little bit more of a planning and comprehensive tool. I've heard it called an extension of a results framework. I hope I didn't confuse you more. I can't see anyone's face. I won't know, but I can provide some resources to maybe simplify the difference between those. Kyle, you have to remind me, your other question was on measuring long-term change?
Yeah, just advice or, strategies, tips for measuring longer term changes that, might not be feasible or, that you might not be able to do within a project life cycle.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And sometimes I start off a theory of change conversation asking, with that, not thinking of within 5 years or within 10 years. Sometimes these are the timeframes, right, that we're working with. But what are we hoping for? Like, what is that long-term impact? And oftentimes the question that comes back is, well, how are we going to measure that? And how are we going to be able to achieve that? So I will say that, I mean, really looking at some of those context indicators is one way of, understanding that your program, so let's go back to maybe the education example, your program may be working in certain regions of a country to improve literacy outcomes is an amazing thing, right? But it works within an overall picture of maybe the country's dedication to education policy overall. And so I'm not really answering your question, Kyle, I know that, but there are ways of, I think, looking at a country's profile in a whole or a certain area in a whole, whether you are making sure that you're looking at some of these indices that track over time. So for health, we often look at the demographic health survey. Sometimes it's census information, it's the World Bank indices that allow us to really track how a country's economic status is doing, health status is doing. So it's hard to do that within a program itself, but what I would recommend to those of you that are thinking of, how to really plan that out, I would look at, if you're working in USAID, looking at the CDCSs, the Country Development Strategy, for the last 5-10 years, if they're available, looking at definitely the current one. I mean, you will see changing priorities of how they are looking and how they are measuring that long-term change. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that is. And maybe, I don't know if this is a follow-up question, but I mean, do you have experience either with, RTI or other organizations or even donors kind of investing in tracking those longer impacts? I guess I know from my experience at RTI, sometimes there are studies that do more longitudinal studies that will follow, people that are involved in a program or activities that go beyond a longer period of time to kind of come back and see, well, 5-10 years later, what are the impacts or what has changed? So have you seen that being common?
So yeah, I mean, I think you really described it well, right? Like having a longitudinal research study is that tool to be able to track that long-term change. I will say, oftentimes, within our programs, whether it be 5 years, 10 years, planning for that, or maybe planning for that is a little hard, right? Because you do have a little bit of more of a time-bound situation to conduct research.
Right.
So really, I think you're right on track with that, Kyle. It's planning for longitudinal studies. I mean, and you're right, at RTI, we certainly do that. Within my own team, and maybe I'll just mention, we actually emphasize what we call operations research or applied research, which is more of, it is short term, it is intentionally to be conducted within the period of time that we are able to, some of it's pilot studies, et cetera, so that we can see the findings and be able to learn and iterate our programming accordingly within that time period. So some of our studies have been 6 months, 1 year, but it does allow us to pivot based on that. So I know that's the other side of the coin from what you just talked about, but other ways I think of learning of what our effects are and impacts are for our programs.
Right. Do you have a kind of a plug or just your perspective in general on the importance of conducting evaluations? And I think this is an important question because, if we look historically at international development, it can be perceived that maybe like the Western world has done more of the evaluations of projects in developing countries, and that might historically be the case, but I guess just convincing the audience and from your experience the importance of kind of everyone buying into conducting evaluations or assessments to really gauge progress.
Yeah. Well, I will kind of throw a different angle, I think, to your question, Kyle, because I do agree. I mean, evaluation is an extremely valuable tool, but I think any of us that have been, more on that program management side of things is that sometimes one, it's hard to fit in for budget, for timing, right? For the resourcing, and that's an important thing to talk about. But if your project is not able to conduct its own evaluation, I really think so that internal evaluation piece that I mentioned, which I think is extremely valuable, and can be very low cost, right? It can be something that you can build in from the beginning and really start to plan for, whether that's year 3, et cetera. But where I was going to go with this is really the learning piece of it is, I believe, really the key to maybe to use your terminology of getting that buy-in. I think oftentimes we start off projects really fast, right? Where there's a lot going on, and that MEL piece isn't as thought through as could be very useful for the program. So it's often separated into maybe a different session, and it's different work planning. So great, we've got our work plan. Okay, we're going to do our MEL plan now. But if you do that together, then you're really integrating, okay, we have these activities and we're going to figure out how to measure them. We're going to figure out how to evaluate them. And when are we going to learn from, what is the information that's coming in? So the reason why I find that the most useful way of getting buy-in is because when you start that learning piece from the very beginning, and coming together and learning together, and I know it might sound very soft and kind of fuzzy, but what I mean by that even is when I talked about target setting, oftentimes it could be very formal, right? Like, we're submitting, this is what we think. But if you create a conversation around target setting to say, let's take a look at some of our data that we are looking at as baseline. Does this make sense to you? And maybe it doesn't, or maybe there's other sources we haven't thought through. I think when we come together for any part of a program, especially for MEL, it really does serve the program's objectives and those that are implementing and those that are affected by what we're working on a lot better.
Perfect, thank you. Pivoting to baseline evaluations, have you had experience or do you have suggestions in the case that a project or program has not conducted a baseline but wants to maybe look at doing an impact evaluation?
Not done a baseline and planning for an impact evaluation. Well, I mean, I would, big put on. Why don't we tackle that in 2 different ways, actually? So I have been part of programs that did not collect baseline data starting off, and that for different reasons and for a variety of reasons can happen. Sometimes it takes a while for the program to come out or really start up. And so baseline data collection, and I did mention this during the webinar, is yes, best done early, best planned, and sometimes things don't go as planned. I would say that a baseline is absolutely important at any stage. If it hasn't been conducted in the first year, to do that in the second year, to really just make sure to ground, because otherwise your MEL plan is sort of floating in space, right? There's nothing to ground your beginning and your starting point. So, so I just want to say that bit. In terms of planning for an impact evaluation, I actually think that, if it just depends, I think, on what intervention you are studying. And baseline data is important for that, but I guess based on what I just said about you could collect baseline a little bit later in the program, I don't think that should deter you from planning for an impact evaluation. But that's something that would be in consideration of, especially if you are looking at something that's time bound within that program.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess I'll just plug, I've had an experience working on conducting an impact evaluation for a project that did not do a baseline. And while it was difficult because, like you're saying, you don't have the initial information about, what a situation is prior to any intervention taking place and what that change is, I think there are still ways to do that. And I think it's also more important, particularly if a project is still ongoing, to look at doing midline and endline evaluations so that at least you have points in time where you can measure some form of change. But I know in that impact evaluation example specifically, we struggled a little bit because interventions had already started when you're collecting data. And so there's, I think, a little bit of massaging that has to take place with looking at data that you are collecting later within a project, and also just making it clear to your audience and within reports that that's kind of that was the situation. So again, I think it's possible. It just makes it a little bit more challenging. But maybe a follow-up question on baselines. Do you find most projects do conduct them, like that is always a part of their implementation plan, or does it really just depend on the type of project and the intervention, and if it's easier to collect data for that particular activity?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I will say that most projects that I've worked on absolutely do. I mean, some of the things that you have brought up are valid points. Sometimes it doesn't happen in the first year, et cetera. I think oftentimes if it's a project that is following a former project, it's a little bit easier, right? Your data is oftentimes pulled from that previous program that you can use as a baseline. Some baselines are 0 and TBD if it's a brand new program. So that obviously can also help to facilitate a baseline a little bit easier. Those that require a heavier lift of like a primary data collection effort, I think are usually the ones that are a little bit harder to get right off the bat. I don't have like a quick solution other than I think when it's best to think through what a baseline is going to look like, during the proposal phase. So if you are the implementer and looking at, okay, well, I know that these are the indicators, or I think these are going to be the indicators that we're going to need to report on, but the baseline doesn't exist. Having the appropriate resources allocated for, a robust baseline effort, I think it's, really the best tool you can give yourself. I know that some of that guidance out there about M&E, MEL should take up 5% of your budget, or, et cetera. I mean, I think that percentage and that allocation is great and has served the MERLA community well. But a baseline, depending on how extensive and how robust it needs to be, really needs to be thought through. So, whether that's bringing in people that really understand research design and baseline, and understand different limitations that you might have getting out there to do primary data collection, I think is really important to think through as soon as you can.
Great, thank you. Talking about qualitative impacts of projects, do you have any examples or experience of measuring qualitative changes and what that looks like? I know sometimes quantitative can be a bit easier to work with, but do you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say at our team specifically, so our MERLA team for our Global Health Division has really embraced qualitative data collection, and that I think that what that allows us to do is really understand the nuances a lot more to some of the data that we're looking at. For example, we have a program that we really wanted to see how a data system, and apologies for being a little bit vague, I'm not sure if the findings are released yet, but we really wanted to see how a data system was being received by its users. So data system has been in place for 10 plus years, and as we've all worked with data systems, they go through so many different iterations, and the program has grown extensively. And so really understanding the user experience is really important. You can't find that information from seeing maybe number of users or, number of times somebody is logging data. I mean, those things are not as telling, I think, as really understanding from the user experience. So we conducted over 40 interviews to be able to find out different experiences from different perspectives, so different types of users, by creating those profiles, and use that data to really inform, I think, changes that affect this particular data system. And so, this might bring up some questions about, well, was that planned and was it budgeted for? So for this particular case, no. And this is actually where I would say learning really comes out as part of becoming a very integral tool and part of your program, right? So when you're implementing and you find that there's an area that could be a really great research study, or qualitative, that requires some qualitative data collection, whether that's focus groups or qualitative interviews. I think it's always a really great approach to have both methods, mixed methods, to be able to help you really understand what's happening within your program. Cal, did I answer your whole question?
A bit, yeah, you did. No, that was great. I appreciate it. Looking a bit more back at the evaluations and assessments, can you maybe dive a bit deeper into the differences between like performance evaluations and assessments, and maybe just examples of what those differences would be?
Sure. So, I mean, a performance evaluation, as I mentioned, is, oftentimes, and probably most of the time, commissioned by your funder. I guess in this case, I would say USA to really take a look at your program at certain points. So, as a summative evaluation, usually at the end of the program, near the end. So this would happen in year 4 or 5, right? So in that often requires an external evaluator coming in for a period of time to do key informant interviews, focus group discussions, really taking a look at the data and the different reports that have been generated throughout the years, talking to donors and beneficiaries, et cetera. So, in that performance evaluation, and this is really actually where it has some linkages to what we talked about during the webinar, right, is taking a look at your theory of change, your results frameworks, the indicators that you've set for the program, the targets, the baseline. I mean, all of that is part of your performance evaluation, right? Because what they're there to see and there to find out is, have you achieved the intended outcomes of the program? So a fairly simple objective that requires a lot of different work and different folks to talk to. And so performance evaluations are, very much in that bucket of a summative evaluation to take a look if a program has achieved what they said they were going to do. Assessments, and I mean, this is where the assessments can really be, run a whole gamut of different things. And the assessments can start off with, the beginning of a program, and you need to understand the environment that you're working in. So a landscape assessment. So for us, it could be, really understanding if we're going to be working in, let's say, the Philippines on family planning programming, right? Is maybe understanding the current landscape that we are working in. So looking at the social, the economic, the political factors that are at play, who are the important stakeholders to think about, right? So Ministry of Health, different clinics that are all part of kind of the health service delivery system, looking at the history of how that has governed family planning in the Philippines, which anyone that's worked in that area knows that it's a very long and kind of complicated history there, right? So that, I think, allows you to really take do a stock taking of what is the landscape. So that's one type of assessment. I mean, there's other assessments I would say that, are often commissioned, whether by USAID, your mission, or your donor, and or just within the program. So I'm seeing a lot more often, I will not speak on it too much because I'm not an expert in this area, but gender assessments, right? So allowing your program, and this often takes either, somebody that really understands how to conduct a gender analyses and gender assessment for the program. So I will just plug here that I don't think this is something that anybody should do on the program. I think it does really require somebody who understands how to apply that lens, right? So gender assessment, I guess, not to go too deep into it, but it's in that same context, right? Really understanding the environment of where gender issues, gender sensitivities are at play. Understanding the dynamics, I think, that you're working in, between beneficiaries, understanding how your program interventions are going to affect persons of different sexes is extremely important. So assessments, I will say, allow a program to really do a stock taking of a certain part of their program, whereas the performance evaluation is really more externally conducted and commissioned by your donor. So hopefully that helps to differentiate those two, at least.
No, that was great. Thank you. Talking about targets a little bit as the guideposts, do you have any tips for being able to set, both ambitious but also realistic targets?
Yeah, right. Okay, well, I will say target setting, and I've talked a little bit, you guys can probably tell I'm a big advocate for kind of practicing what you preach, right? So starting off from the proposal stage, oftentimes we are asked to set targets, and I guess for the sanity of your implementation team, if you were to win this project, is really to spend time talking to technical experts on the ground, talking to folks that have implemented similar or even the previous program to do target setting, I think, in a very intentional way. So I guess I can mention some not so great practices is, I think oftentimes if we don't think that through and we are just putting ambitious targets, as you mentioned, you're not grounding your program in, I guess, to go back to that criteria that I talked about, right? SMART, being specific and realistic, I think is the most important thing. So I guess not to go down like a rabbit hole of best practices, I would say that starting early and bringing in key folks. So this should not be done in a vacuum, right? We do not operate in a vacuum when we are implementing our programs. And so bringing in different perspectives and ground truthing your targets with a baseline. So really even going back to what we were just talking about, right? Without a baseline, how do you know where you're starting? How do you know how to measure what you've done since that baseline? So I think those are all very key components of target setting.
Great. Talking about learning, I think this is an important point to mention on this webinar. But a lot of the ways we as people learn is through our failures, and so as the learning component of MEL and working with your stakeholders, what are some ways that you can openly and honestly be able to address failures through activities or things you thought were going to work that didn't work, to then be able to feed into your learning within a project?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, Kyle, because I would say, and you can probably tell I'm such an advocate of learning, because in my own practice, I have found it has been probably such a game changer of how to communicate with my team, to communicate with, USAID, our funder, our partners. And the reason I say that is because when we set out a proposal, and then when we set out our work plan, project plan, it will always, nothing, it's not going to go 100% to plan, right? I mean, I think that it's almost a given. I mean, and to say that things are going to go exactly the way we planned out, I think is very unlikely. However, we do our best, and I know that to some, maybe that doesn't sit as well, because, I know that we want to put our best foot forward, and we want to show that we can and we will achieve X, Y, and Z. And I think that is fantastic, and that is a really great way to, stay motivated and stay on top of your program. However, it's almost like when, not if, when something is not going to plan. And so that's why I'm almost a little hesitant to say failure. It's more that when something changes, when something that you didn't plan for happens, right? This is why we write in critical assumptions when we write our MEL plan, or these are the things that we believe that as long as, things are politically, economically stable, that, natural disaster doesn't, those are a little bit more, high level there, but even just, hey, that there's still going to be a demand for this service that we believe there is a demand for. But if that changes, if and when, or rather I say when something does not go to plan, having a relationship with your other partners and your stakeholders, I think is really the key to learning, right? Is that we're in this together, that we all want to reach our intended objectives, that, we believe. And this is why I really love working in this industry, right? Is that folks in this space care, and we all are caring together. And so having that open space. And so I can share something in the resource list that I didn't get to add to, but principles of learning, right? Is that we're not here to point fingers, but we're here to talk about what happened and what we can do, and what needs to happen to be able to get back on track, or maybe we need to change course. That I think it's almost like that soft skill, those nuanced parts of running these programs, and being like a MEL specialist. So.
No, that's great. I love how you said when, not if, because I do think, talking about these things as failures is maybe the wrong way to approach it, because I think we do expect that in any project that we work on, and any change that we're trying to bring about, that things are not going to always go as planned, which is why, project teams have built in these systems for being able to, reflect and learn and adapt, and be able to incorporate that back in. So I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely. And Kyle, if I can add one quick thing, I meant to mention it.
Sure.
One other thing that I do think is sometimes overlooked as just a valuable tool is a communications plan. And I don't just mean a communications plan for, how we are going to promote a new tool or, new resource that our project comes out with, but actually a communication plan in, how we are going to communicate together as a project team, how me as a MERLA specialist is going to communicate with the chief of party. And I know that might be a little bit hard to put down on paper, but even talking through, right? We all have different ways of communicating. Some are better with written communication, some are just, better in person. I think even if it is just something you're talking through and you as a technical leader on a project is thinking through, that I have found has been very valuable, right? Like not everybody can read a 25-page quarterly report and glean like the high level points that they really need to get out of it, but they can read maybe an email that really just gets to the point when something is important and needs to be conveyed. So I think having those alternate ways of communicating and understanding communication preferences is also a very great way of going about learning together. So thanks for letting me make that plug.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really important. We talked a lot about the key tools that are, imperative and essential to M&E. Are there systems, and when I say systems, like more, whether that's software or programs or something like that, that M&E teams use to be able to actually track and analyze data? I'm not as familiar with that, and I'm just curious if that exists.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Kyle. Well, I will say, having worked in the M&E space for a little bit, is that I definitely have seen a lot of tools pop up, right? There's a lot of ICT for D methods, approaches, tools out there, and I don't think we're at a shortage of those. But I will say that sometimes I find that the tool is driving the need versus the need driving the tool. That's not a saying, I just made that up. But what I mean by that, though, is really that, and I've been asked this as an M&E focal point for different projects, is, oh, can you build us a database, or can you, figure out a communication system, or what software should we use? But I don't think we're asking the right questions when we start to go down that path, right? It's like, how are we going to use this data, and how will we analyze it? And I think oftentimes we start to, I've used a lot of this software, and I have found some systems to be really awesome. And that's actually not to knock any system that isn't. I'm not saying that. I just mean more that I've also been in the position where the tool and software was handed to me, and then I built it, I spent a ton of time working on it, then nobody used it. So you run into the issue, I think, of that example that I used about that data system. That, I think, is, and we are moving towards, I think in the development community, we are moving towards more, user-centered design, right? And not just another buzzword, I would say, especially as MEL specialists, is that this is a really good thing for us to think of, is who is going to use this data, and how are they going to use it, and how can I make sure that the information is packaged in a way and is conveyed in a way. So going back to that communications piece, going back to the learning part of it, is that it will influence, it will serve its purpose of being evidence for a decision maker. So really going, I think, into that versus building a system that, so, okay, I didn't answer your question, Kyle. So what systems have I found? I mean, honestly, that really depends. And so it's hard for me to answer, right? I think we have to take in consideration, and this is actually a very good assessment to do, is, like an ICT assessment, is what are the factors that I should consider before building one, right? Is there connectivity? Is there, what are the capabilities? We did an assessment of a national health data system in Zambia, and found that there were computers, at different health facilities, and nobody was using them. And when we went back to really interview and figure out why, well, it was because nobody actually knew how to use the computer, right? So it had nothing to do with the system.
Right.
It had nothing to do with. So I think doing that type of assessment before building a system is extremely important because it can be very costly and it takes a lot of time. And I find a lot of value in them, but demand, the need should not drive the tool, or the tool should not drive the need, I think.
Right. Perfect. So putting you on the hot seat, maybe with a last question before we close. Just in your experience, how have you seen monitoring evaluation or MEL evolve or change over time? And I guess maybe what are some thoughts you have in terms of where it may be going in terms of changing in the future?
Ooh, that is a hot seat question. Well, I mean, I've talked a lot about learning, and you can probably see that is actually where I find we are starting to move towards a lot more. I've seen it from, it'd be tough because I don't think us as a MEL community, we can't say that, hey, we are at stage X right now with all programs, right? Some programs are still some sectors are still really struggling with collecting data, quality data, right? And understanding indicator definitions. And so back to the basics, I think we never should forget those. We should build the building blocks of our MEL system and not forget that, there are different capacities that we need to consider. But if I kind of had to take us as a whole community and move us forward, I would say this learning space has been, again, absolutely just game changing for me and my practice and our team. Mainly because by opening up that conversation for CLA, it has given our projects and our leadership a different lens to look at their programs. And so, for those of you out there who are implementing as MEL or M&E specialists, consider how learning can work for you in your program, and that it really has been, I would say, I'm hoping that we continue down that path, but we do not forget the basics. So I hope that sort of shows where I stand in it, right? Is that I don't want to be all technology, everything is digital, without recognizing that folks still, are struggling to learn how to use a computer first, right? So never forgetting, I think, where we're starting, but moving towards a more open space of being able to discuss when things don't go the way that we planned, when they don't, right?
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for your awesome presentation, Molly, and all of your insights from your experience. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all the participants who have joined. As a reminder, you'll receive the brief survey at the end. We'd love if you would just complete that and give us some feedback. We have 2 webinar sessions left of this series, so please stick with us for those 2. They're going to be really informative. We've kind of gone back and forth between integrating project management and more specific sessions in terms of horticulture, and I think the following 2 are going to be more into horticultural aspects and strategies. So don't miss those. The next one will be September 12th. That's on how to improve post-harvest management for horticultural crops. Also, just another reminder that we have posted the past 6 webinars online with the recordings and the presentations and the resources. So please continue to check back there. If you've missed any, or if you want to pull down a resource, we'll work on getting this one up by next week. Thank you again for joining, and look forward to speaking with you next time.